Robert Birnbaum was the kind of man who seemed destined for success. A skilled plastic surgeon with a polished demeanor, Robert was admired by his colleagues and patients alike. His life in the bustling heart of New York City was, by all outward appearances, a shining example of the American dream. But beneath the veneer of his seemingly perfect life lay cracks that only those closest to him could see. Gail Katz, his wife, was a vibrant, intelligent woman with a quick wit and a contagious laugh. She had dreams of building a life filled with joy and independence, but her marriage to Robert was anything but fulfilling. Over time, the charm that had once drawn her to him began to feel like a trap. His affection had turned into control, and his attentiveness now felt suffocating. Gail's world became increasingly confined, her every move watched, her decisions questioned. At social gatherings, the Birnbaums maintained their picture-perfect image. Robert would drape an arm over Gail's shoulder, smiling as though they were the happiest couple in the room. But those who knew Gail well could sense something was wrong. Her smile never reached her eyes. Friends whispered among themselves, noting how she seemed distracted, even anxious. One evening during a party at a colleague's upscale apartment, Gail quietly excused herself to the balcony. Her sister, who had accompanied her, followed shortly after, sensing her unease. "I can't keep doing this," Gail confessed in a hushed tone, her hands gripping the cold metal railing. "I feel like I'm drowning, Robert. He won't let me breathe." Her sister urged her to take action, to leave if she felt unsafe, but Gail shook her head. "It's not that simple. If I leave, I don't know what he's capable of." Inside, Robert was the epitome of charm, laughing and gesturing animatedly in conversation. He would occasionally glance toward the balcony, his eyes narrowing when he noticed Gail and her sister deep in discussion. When Gail returned to the room, his arm instinctively tightened around her waist, a silent reminder of his presence. As the night drew to a close, Robert's irritation was thinly veiled. On the drive home, the car was silent except for the hum of the engine. When they reached their apartment, Robert finally broke the silence. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said coldly. Gail didn't respond. She simply walked to the bedroom, leaving him standing alone in the dimly lit living room. Gail's days were increasingly filled with quiet dread. She began confiding in close friends, speaking cautiously, but making it clear she felt trapped. "I just want to be free," she told one confidant over coffee, "but I don't know how to make it happen. He controls everything. My time, my choices, even the way I think." Her friend urged her to seek help, but Gail hesitated. "If I disappear," she said with a weak smile, her voice barely above a whisper, "promise me you'll look at him first." The weight of her words lingered in the air, unspoken fears crystallizing into grim possibilities. And yet life continued as usual, or so it seemed. Gail dutifully played the role of a supportive wife, while Robert maintained his reputation as the charming doctor with a perfect life. No one on the outside could have guessed the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The morning after the party, Gail awoke to an oppressive silence. Robert was already gone, likely at his clinic, leaving behind the faint scent of aftershave and a void that seemed to fill the entire apartment. She exhaled slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed, her thoughts racing. The tension between them had become unbearable, yet she couldn't find a way out. As she made her way into the kitchen, her phone buzzed. It was her sister. "Are you okay? You seemed so off last night," her sister's voice carried concern. Gail hesitated before responding, her voice faltering. "I'm fine, really, just tired." But she wasn't fine. The cracks in their marriage were widening, and Gail could feel it in every interaction. Robert's charming exterior was a facade she could no longer reconcile with his volatile temper behind closed doors. By the time Robert returned home that evening, Gail had steeled herself for another confrontation. Dinner was quiet, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. Gail finally broke the silence. "I want us to see someone, a counselor. We need help, Robert." He paused, his fork hovering midair, before slowly lowering it. His gaze was sharp, piercing. "You think there's something wrong with me?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. "It's not about blame," she replied carefully, her heart pounding. "It's about us." Robert's hand clenched around his glass. "We don't need help, Gail. What we need is for you to stop imagining problems that don't exist." The conversation ended there, but the tension only grew. In the weeks that followed, Gail began to take small steps toward reclaiming her independence. She started reconnecting with friends, people she had distanced herself from during the early years of her marriage. One of these friends was Sarah, a coworker who had always admired Gail's tenacity. Over coffee, Gail confided in Sarah about her struggles. "It's like I'm living with two different people," she said, stirring her cup absently. "The Robert everyone sees is charming, kind, generous. But the one I live with, he scares me." Sarah looked at her with wide eyes. "Gail, you can't keep living like this. You have to do something." "I know," Gail whispered. "I'm just afraid." As the days passed, Gail's resolve grew stronger. She started researching divorce lawyers, jotting down names and numbers in a small notebook she kept hidden in her purse. It wasn't long before Robert found it. "What's this?" he demanded, holding the notebook up like a piece of damning evidence. Gail froze, her blood running cold. "It's nothing," she said quickly, reaching for it. But Robert pulled it away, his expression darkening. "Are you planning something, Gail?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage she had. "I'm tired, Robert. I can't keep living like this." His reaction was swift and alarming. He slammed the notebook onto the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his tone laced with a quiet menace. "You'll ruin everything." That night, Gail stayed awake long after Robert had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering how she had let things get this far. The next morning, she made a decision. She would leave, no matter the cost. But as she began to quietly put her plan into motion, Gail couldn't shake the feeling that Robert was watching her every move. His gaze lingered too long, his questions cut too deeply. She knew she had to be careful. If Robert suspected anything, the consequences could be catastrophic. It was a humid summer evening in New York City, July 7th, 1985. The day had passed in an uneasy quiet, with Gail keeping her distance from Robert. The tension in the apartment was almost tangible, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. As the sun set, casting a warm orange glow through the city's skyline, Gail sat by the window, staring out as if searching for an escape. Dinner was uneventful. Robert made casual conversation about his day at the clinic, but Gail barely responded. She was preoccupied, her mind spinning with thoughts of her plan. She had made up her mind. This was her last night here. Tomorrow she would leave. She had spoken to her sister earlier, quietly explaining her intentions. "I just need one more night," she had said, her voice trembling. As the clock struck 10, Robert retreated to his study, a glass of bourbon in hand. Gail took this opportunity to start packing a small bag. She moved cautiously, careful not to make any noise. The apartment was eerily silent, every creak of the floorboards amplified in her ears. Her heart raced as she zipped up the bag and tucked it beneath the bed. At around midnight, Gail decided to get some air. She grabbed her keys and stepped out into the hallway, taking a deep breath. The building was quiet, most of the residents already asleep. She walked down the block, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. For a brief moment, she felt a sense of freedom, but it was fleeting. When she returned to the apartment, Robert was waiting for her. He stood in the dimly lit living room, his silhouette sharp against the glow of a single table lamp. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice calm but cold. "I just needed some air," Gail replied, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Robert stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "At this hour? Gail, don't lie to me." "I'm not lying," she insisted, but her voice faltered. Robert's gaze bore into her, and she felt exposed, vulnerable. Without another word, Robert turned and walked away, disappearing into the bedroom. Gail stood there for a moment, frozen, before finally moving to the couch. She sat down, her head in her hands, her breath shaky. The hours dragged on. Gail eventually fell into a restless sleep, only to be awakened by the sound of movement. She glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m. She listened intently, her heart pounding. There was a muffled thud, followed by the faint creak of the front door. She got up, moving cautiously toward the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and Robert was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as she scanned the apartment. Her bag was gone. The fear that had lingered in the back of her mind now consumed her entirely. She ran to the window and looked down at the street below. In the dim glow of the streetlights, she saw Robert loading something into the trunk of his car. She couldn't make out what it was, but her instincts told her it was bad, very bad. By the time Gail worked up the courage to confront him, Robert had already driven away. She stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. What was he doing? Where was he going? The night stretched on, the oppressive silence only broken by the occasional sound of a car passing by. Gail's phone rang once. It was her sister. But Gail didn't answer. She couldn't. What could she say? By the next morning, Gail was gone. The apartment was quiet when Robert returned, his expression unreadable. He went about his morning as if nothing had happened. When the phone rang later that day, he picked it up without hesitation. "No, Gail's not here," he told the caller, his tone casual. "She left last night after an argument. I assume she needed some space." It was the beginning of a story he would repeat many times in the days and weeks to come. But those who knew Gail didn't believe it. Her sister, her friends, and her family, none of them accepted the idea that she would simply walk away without a word. And yet there was no sign of her, no calls, no messages, no trace. Gail Katz had vanished, leaving behind only questions and a gnawing suspicion that the man she had feared most was the one who held the answers. The days following Gail's disappearance were marked by an unsettling stillness. Robert Birnbaum went about his life with a chilling normalcy that left those around him both perplexed and uneasy. At the clinic, he maintained his professional demeanor, greeting patients with his characteristic charm and confidence. To an outsider, he appeared entirely unbothered, as if Gail's absence were just another passing inconvenience. When neighbors asked about her, Robert's responses were disturbingly casual. "She left after an argument," he would say, his tone devoid of emotion. "She's done this before. I'm sure she'll come back once she calms down." Yet Gail's closest friends and family knew this wasn't true. Gail had never stormed off in the middle of the night without telling someone where she was going. Something was terribly wrong. Gail's sister, who had been growing increasingly concerned, decided to confront Robert. She arrived unannounced at the apartment one evening, her heart pounding as she knocked on the door. Robert opened it with a calm expression, his demeanor as polished as ever. "Oh, it's you," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Where's Gail, Robert?" she demanded, skipping pleasantries. "I've already told you," he replied evenly. "She left. I don't know where she went." "That doesn't make sense," she snapped, her voice rising. "She wouldn't just leave without telling anyone. You know that." Robert's face darkened slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. "I understand you're upset," he said, his tone carefully measured. "But I don't have answers for you. She left of her own accord, that's all I know." The conversation left her more unsettled than ever. As she walked out of the apartment building, she couldn't shake the feeling that Robert was hiding something. Meanwhile, the police had begun their initial investigation. Detectives visited the Birnbaum apartment, but Robert's cooperative attitude gave them little reason for suspicion at first. He explained that Gail had been under a lot of stress and suggested she might have gone to stay with friends or even left the city for some time to herself. But as the days turned into weeks and no one heard from Gail, the doubts began to grow. Her family and friends were relentless in their calls to the authorities, refusing to accept Robert's version of events. "We need to look closer at him," one detective finally remarked after yet another tense phone call from Gail's sister. "Something about his calmness doesn't sit right." And so they did. A deeper dive into Robert's behavior began to reveal inconsistencies. For one, his claim that Gail had taken personal items with her didn't hold up. Her purse, identification, and most of her clothes were still in the apartment. A neighbor also mentioned seeing Robert late at night, carrying what appeared to be a large bag to his car. When confronted with these details, Robert shrugged them off. "I took some old clothes to donate," he said smoothly. "Is that a crime?" But the investigators weren't convinced. They began tracing his movements on the night Gail disappeared, piecing together a timeline that raised more questions than answers. Where had Robert gone in the middle of the night? What was in the bag? The most significant breakthrough came when they discovered Robert's pilot's license. A meticulous review of flight records revealed that he had rented a small plane on the morning of July 8th, just hours after Gail was last seen. The plane had departed from a nearby airfield and returned a few hours later with no clear explanation for its purpose. When asked about this, Robert was quick to dismiss their suspicions. "Flying relaxes me," he said, his calm demeanor intact. "It was just a routine flight, nothing unusual." But for the detectives, this was anything but routine. The idea of a missing woman, a late-night trip, and a flight with no destination painted a picture they couldn't ignore. The calm that Robert projected, so measured, so deliberate, was beginning to feel like something far more sinister. As investigators delved deeper into Robert Birnbaum's alibi, the details became increasingly unsettling. His calm explanations for Gail's disappearance had already begun to unravel, but it was his connection to a private aircraft that transformed the case into something far darker. The discovery of Robert's pilot's license had been a game changer. Not only was he a licensed pilot, but he frequently rented small planes from an airfield just outside the city. Investigators traced his activities on the day after Gail's disappearance, uncovering a flight he had taken early in the morning. The logs confirmed that Robert rented a plane and flew out for several hours, but no destination was recorded. When questioned, Robert remained composed. "Flying is a hobby of mine," he said, his voice steady. "It's how I clear my head. That morning I just needed some time alone to think." But this explanation didn't sit well with the detectives. A routine flight, just hours after his wife vanished? The timing was too convenient. As they probed further, a worker at the airfield came forward with a chilling account. The man recalled seeing Robert arrive early that morning carrying a large duffel bag. He described how Robert loaded the bag into the plane with little effort, his demeanor calm but focused. "I didn't think much of it at the time," the worker admitted. "People bring all sorts of things when they fly, but now, knowing what happened to his wife, it's hard not to wonder." The detectives pressed Robert on the contents of the bag, but he was evasive. "Just some old clothes and personal items I didn't need," he said dismissively. His nonchalance only deepened their suspicions. Forensic experts began piecing together the flight's trajectory. Though no official records detailed his route, radar data showed that Robert's plane had flown out over the Atlantic Ocean before circling back several hours later. This revelation sent chills through the investigative team. The vast open waters provided the perfect cover for someone looking to make something, or someone, disappear. Meanwhile, Gail's family and friends were growing increasingly frustrated. Weeks had passed with no word from her, and every interaction with Robert only amplified their fears. Her sister, in particular, was relentless in demanding answers. "You can't keep pretending like nothing happened," she yelled during one tense exchange. "Where is she, Robert? What did you do to her?" Robert's response was as calculated as ever. "I've told you everything I know," he said, his tone edged with irritation. "I'm grieving too, you know. This isn't easy for me either." But there was no trace of grief in his actions, only a chilling detachment that made even the most seasoned detectives uneasy. The investigators pressed on, turning their attention to the logistics of the flight. Could a man like Robert, trained and methodical, really have used his piloting skills to cover up a crime? The theory was grim but plausible. Without a body, proving foul play would be an uphill battle. A breakthrough came when the airfield worker revealed one more detail. After the flight, Robert had returned the plane spotless with an unusual request. He asked if there was any way to expedite the routine cleaning process, insisting that the plane needed to be ready for the next renter. This request, though seemingly benign, raised alarms. Why the urgency to clean? And why had Robert gone to such lengths to ensure there were no records of his destination? The mounting circumstantial evidence painted a disturbing picture, one that investigators couldn't ignore. Robert's flight over the Atlantic, his unexplained duffel bag, and his eerie calmness were more than just coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle that hinted at something sinister. The detectives knew they were closing in on the truth, but without concrete evidence, their case remained fragile. They needed more, something undeniable that would expose Robert for what he truly was. The sky, vast and unyielding, had its secrets, and somewhere within its endless expanse lay the answers they sought. The calm facade Robert had so carefully maintained was starting to crack. But it wasn't just the investigators' questions or Gail's disappearance that threatened to expose him. A secret from his personal life was about to surface, one that would shift the narrative entirely. It began with a phone call. An anonymous tipster contacted the police, claiming that Robert had been romantically involved with a coworker before Gail's disappearance. At first, the information seemed speculative, but as detectives pursued the lead, it quickly became clear that this wasn't just gossip. Robert's affair wasn't just a betrayal of Gail. It was a potential motive. Detectives tracked down the woman in question, a nurse who had worked with Robert at his clinic. Vanessa Grant, a reserved but sharp professional, initially hesitated to speak. She was visibly uneasy when questioned, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I don't want to get involved in this," she said quietly, but the weight of what she knew seemed to press on her shoulders. After several minutes, she relented, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I was seeing Robert," she admitted. It wasn't serious, not to me anyway, but to him, it was different. Vanessa described how Robert had become increasingly possessive during their time together. He would often vent about Gail, painting her as unstable and difficult. He said she was holding him back, Vanessa recalled. He talked about how he wanted to move on, to start fresh, without her. Her words sent chills through the investigators. While Vanessa insisted she had no direct knowledge of Gail's disappearance, her testimony painted a damning picture of Robert's state of mind in the months leading up to that fateful night. It wasn't just frustration or dissatisfaction. It was anger, resentment. And then she added something that made the room go silent. One time, she said, her voice trembling slightly, he joked about how easy it would be to make someone disappear. I didn't take it seriously at the time, but now. She trailed off, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Vanessa wasn't the only one with insight into Robert's double life. Gail's friends had long suspected that Robert wasn't faithful, and some even believed Gail had discovered the affair. One friend, Sarah, came forward with a striking memory. Just weeks before her disappearance, Gail had confided in her. She found something, Sarah explained. Emails, I think. She was furious. She said she confronted him and he denied everything, but she knew he was lying. Confronting Robert was a dangerous move, Sarah believed. She told me she was scared, she said, her voice breaking. She said she didn't trust him anymore, that she didn't know what he was capable of. As these pieces came together, the investigators saw a motive taking shape. Robert's affair wasn't just a betrayal. It was a reason for him to see Gail as an obstacle, a threat. Gail's intention to leave him, possibly even to expose his infidelity, could have shattered the carefully curated image he worked so hard to maintain. For a man like Robert, whose reputation was everything, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was intolerable. The detectives pressed Robert on the matter, but he was unflappable. Vanessa was a colleague, he said smoothly, nothing more. Whatever she told you is her interpretation, not mine. His denial was as polished as ever, but the weight of the evidence was beginning to stack against him. Vanessa's testimony, combined with Gail's friends' accounts, painted a picture of a man cornered by his own lies. And like any cornered animal, Robert was dangerous. The detectives knew they were getting closer to the truth, but they also knew they had to tread carefully. A man capable of making someone disappear once might not hesitate to do it again. The mask Robert Birnbaum had carefully crafted over the years was beginning to slip, and those around him were starting to see the man hidden beneath the charming exterior. The investigation had reached a tipping point. Detectives now had a growing pile of evidence. His unexplained flight, the duffel bag, Vanessa's testimony, and Gail's growing fear. But they needed something more, a definitive crack in his armor. Robert's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. At the clinic, colleagues noticed that he seemed distracted, irritable, even paranoid. When asked about Gail, he stuck to his story, repeating it like a mantra. She left. She needed time. I don't know where she is. But the words lacked conviction, and those who heard them couldn't ignore the chill that followed. Behind the scenes, detectives worked tirelessly to uncover more about Robert's movements on the night of Gail's disappearance. They began interviewing neighbors again, hoping to find something they had missed. One elderly woman, who lived a few floors below the Birnbaums, finally came forward with a detail she hadn't thought important before. I saw him that night, she said. Around 3 in the morning, he was carrying something heavy down the stairs. It looked like a bag, but I didn't think much of it. Just figured he was doing laundry or something strange at that hour. Her account added another piece to the puzzle, corroborating the timeline that placed Robert at the airfield with the mysterious duffel bag. Investigators began connecting the dots, and a picture of premeditation emerged. At the same time, they revisited a key piece of evidence, the flight logs. While Robert insisted that his flight was nothing more than a routine outing, radar data told a different story. His plane had flown in a circular pattern over the Atlantic Ocean, a maneuver that made little sense unless he had a specific purpose. The detectives began exploring the logistics of his flight. Could a man like Robert, meticulous and detail-oriented, have used this trip to dispose of evidence? And if so, what exactly had he left behind in the ocean's depths? Pressure continued to mount as Gail's family pushed for answers. Her sister, determined not to let the case fade into obscurity, appeared on local news programs pleading for information. Gail wouldn't just leave, she said, her voice breaking during one interview. She was scared. She told me she was scared of him. Someone has to know something. The public began taking notice, and with that attention came new leads. A former colleague of Robert's reached out to the police, recalling a chilling conversation he'd had with him years prior. "He told me once," the man said, "that if you plan well enough, you can make anyone disappear. At the time, I thought it was just talk, but now, I'm not so sure." This revelation added another layer to the growing portrait of Robert as a man who thrived on control and manipulation. Investigators began piecing together his psychological profile, consulting experts to understand the mind of someone capable of such a heinous act. The analysis was clear. Robert was a man who couldn't tolerate losing. Whether it was his professional reputation or his personal life, everything had to remain under his control. But it wasn't just the investigators who were starting to see through Robert's mask. His actions were drawing suspicion from those closest to him. Vanessa, the woman with whom he'd had the affair, revealed something that sent shivers down the detective's spines. "The last time I saw him," she said, "he told me, 'It's over now. Everything is handled.' At the time, I didn't know what he meant, but now—" The pieces were falling into place, but there was still one crucial element missing: Gail herself. Without her body, without physical evidence, the case remained tenuous. Investigators knew they were walking a fine line. Robert was dangerous, and the closer they got to the truth, the more volatile he became. Despite his growing unease, Robert continued to maintain his outward composure, attending social events and working at his clinic as though nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, the cracks in his mask were widening. The man who had built his life on control was losing his grip, and the world around him was starting to see the monster beneath. The investigation into Gail Katz's disappearance had reached a fever pitch. Every new lead seemed to uncover another layer of deception surrounding Robert Birnbaum. The once respected surgeon now stood at the center of a tangled web of lies, each thread threatening to unravel the pristine image he had worked so hard to maintain. Detectives continued to push Robert, but his responses were calculated and cold. "I've already told you everything," he repeated during another round of questioning. His calmness, once seen as professionalism, now felt like an impenetrable wall, crafted to obscure the truth. But Robert's lies were no longer holding. A former co-worker at the clinic had come forward with troubling details. "He always needed to be in control," the co-worker said, their voice low, "and if he felt that slipping, he'd make sure no one could take it from him." This insight into Robert's personality added context to his behavior. Detectives began to see how Gail's growing independence might have been the ultimate threat to a man like Robert. She had planned to leave him, to disrupt the life he had so meticulously built, and Robert couldn't allow that. Meanwhile, another discovery further complicated the case. A forensic team had been analyzing Robert's car for weeks. Though he'd claimed he hadn't transported anything suspicious, small traces of organic material were found in the trunk. While the results were inconclusive, they hinted at the possibility of blood, an ominous detail that investigators couldn't ignore. When confronted with this, Robert's demeanor changed for the first time. His normally steady voice faltered. "I don't know how that got there," he said, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The detectives exchanged a glance. It wasn't a confession, but it was the closest they'd come to cracking his composure. But the most damning revelation came from an unexpected source. An airfield attendant, previously reluctant to speak, finally admitted to seeing something unusual the morning of Robert's flight. "I saw him with a bag," the man said, shifting nervously in his seat. "It looked heavy. He was struggling to carry it." The attendant's statement, combined with radar logs showing Robert's erratic flight path over the Atlantic, painted a chilling picture. Investigators theorized that Robert had used the flight to dispose of Gail's body, dropping her into the ocean, where recovery would be nearly impossible. While these pieces of evidence were circumstantial, they were damning nonetheless. Robert's calculated nature, his repeated lies, and the growing inconsistencies in his story all pointed to one undeniable truth: he was hiding something. The detectives weren't the only ones seeing through Robert's facade. Gail's sister had been relentless in her pursuit of answers, appearing on talk shows and contacting anyone who might help. In one interview, her voice cracked as she addressed Robert directly. "You know where she is," she said, her hands shaking. "Why won't you just tell us the truth?" The public pressure mounted. More people came forward with stories of Robert's temper and his controlling behavior. Former acquaintances described him as charming but intense, with one woman recounting how he'd once cornered her during an argument, his demeanor turning icy. He was scary, she admitted, like he could snap at any moment. As the walls closed in around him, Robert's mask of composure began to slip further. He avoided eye contact during interviews, his answers becoming shorter, more clipped. Investigators noticed his growing agitation, but knew they still needed one critical piece of evidence to break the case wide open. Then, in a surprising twist, a coworker from Robert's past provided a shocking piece of information. He talked about flying all the time, the coworker said, and once, during a casual conversation, he joked about how the ocean is the perfect hiding place. "No one can find anything out there," he said. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now..." The detectives couldn't ignore the implications. Every lie, every evasion, every carefully crafted detail in Robert's story was falling apart. What had once seemed like a routine investigation was now a race to uncover the truth before it disappeared, just like Gail. The web of lies Robert had spun was collapsing, each thread breaking under the weight of the evidence. And yet, the most haunting question remained unanswered. What had he done to Gail? The trial of Robert Birnbaum began in a packed courtroom, its seats filled with reporters, spectators, and Gail Katz's family and friends. The air was thick with tension, as though the room itself was holding its breath. It had taken over a decade to bring Robert to justice, and now the stakes couldn't be higher. Without Gail's body, the prosecution's case rested on circumstantial evidence and the hope that the jury would see through Robert's polished exterior. As Robert entered the courtroom, he was the picture of composure. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to admiration. But his eyes betrayed him. They were sharp, scanning the room, calculating every movement. For Gail's family, it was a chilling reminder of the man they believed had stolen their daughter, their sister, their friend. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, laying out the narrative they had built over years of painstaking investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lead prosecutor began, his voice steady but heavy with conviction, "this case is about control. It's about a man who couldn't bear to lose it, and the unimaginable lengths he went to keep it." Piece by piece, the prosecution presented their case. They detailed Robert's controlling behavior, his volatile temper, and the crumbling state of his marriage. Witnesses testified about Gail's growing fear, her plans to leave, and Robert's obsessive need to maintain his image. Vanessa Grant, the nurse with whom Robert had had an affair, took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted his chilling words. "It's over now. Everything is handled." But the most damning testimony came from the airfield worker. Calmly but firmly, he described seeing Robert with the heavy duffel bag and how his demeanor had been unusually intense that morning. "I remember thinking it was strange," the worker said. "He seemed focused, like he had a mission." The defense, however, was equally determined. They argued that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and lacked physical evidence. Without a body, they said, there was no proof that Gail was even dead. "My client is not a murderer," Robert's lawyer declared. "He is a husband grieving the loss of his wife, a wife who chose to leave, nothing more." Robert's own testimony was a masterclass in manipulation. He spoke with measured emotion, carefully portraying himself as a loving husband blindsided by his wife's disappearance. "I've spent every day wondering where she went," he said, his voice breaking at just the right moments. "I loved Gail. I still do." But for all his polish, cracks in his story began to show under cross-examination. When pressed about the flight, his answers became evasive. Why had he flown over the Atlantic? What was in the duffel bag? "I needed time to think," he said repeatedly, his earlier confidence waning. The prosecution seized on these inconsistencies, using them to paint a portrait of a man who had meticulously planned Gail's disappearance. This was no accident, they argued. This was the calculated act of a man who saw his wife not as a partner, but as a problem to be solved. The trial was grueling, stretching over weeks as the prosecution and defense battled for the jury's belief. Gail's sister, her voice breaking with emotion, delivered the most heart-wrenching testimony of all. "She told me she was scared of him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "She told me she didn't know what he was capable of. And now we know." As the days turned into weeks, the jury listened intently, their expressions unreadable. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy only grew. Headlines screamed of the doctor on trial and the vanishing wife mystery, while opinion pieces debated whether circumstantial evidence was enough to convict. Inside, the tension reached a boiling point as both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution ended with a powerful plea. Gail Katz deserves justice, her family deserves answers, and the man who took her life deserves to be held accountable. As the jury was sent to deliberate, the room emptied, leaving only the echoes of the trial's final moments. For Gail's family, it was the culmination of years of heartbreak and unanswered questions. For Robert, it was a waiting game, one he had always believed he could win. But the evidence, the lies, and the cracks in his mask told a different story. And now, it was up to the jury to decide. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats. Every eye was fixed on them, every breath held in anticipation. It had been 3 days since deliberations began, 3 agonizing days filled with uncertainty for Gail's family and tense composure from Robert Birnbaum. Now it was time for the answer they had all been waiting for. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a stoic expression, stood as the judge asked the question that would define the case. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," she replied. Her voice was steady, but the weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. Gail's sister sat in the gallery, clutching a tissue tightly in her hands, her knuckles white. Robert sat at the defense table, his face an impenetrable mask, as though he believed he could will the verdict in his favor through sheer confidence. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but Robert didn't react. The foreperson unfolded the piece of paper in her hand. "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant—" She paused, the room holding its collective breath. "Guilty." The word seemed to echo through the courtroom, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. Gail's family erupted into quiet sobs of relief, her sister burying her face in her hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. After years of pain and unanswered questions, justice had finally been served. Robert, for the first time throughout the trial, visibly tensed, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Yet, he kept his composure, refusing to let his mask slip entirely. His lawyer immediately requested a mistrial, citing the circumstantial nature of the evidence, but the judge dismissed the motion. The prosecutor rose to address the court, his voice firm and resolute. "This verdict is a testament to the tireless efforts of law enforcement, to the courage of witnesses who came forward, and to a family that refused to give up hope. Gail Katz may no longer be with us, but her voice has been heard today." As Robert was led away in handcuffs, he turned briefly to face Gail's family. His expression was cold, his lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes, a defiance that refused to accept the reality of his situation. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited eagerly. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward as Gail's sister stepped out, flanked by her family. Her voice wavered as she addressed the media. "Today, we got justice for Gail. It's not the closure we wanted, we still don't know where she is, but we know the man who took her from us will finally pay for what he did." The sentence was delivered later that day, 20 years to life in prison. For Gail's family, it was a bittersweet moment. The verdict acknowledged Robert's guilt, but it couldn't bring Gail back. And with her body still missing, a part of their grief remained unresolved. As Robert was escorted to his cell, he maintained his silence. There would be no confession, no apology. To the end, he held on to his version of events, that Gail had left of her own accord, that he was innocent. But the evidence, the lies, and the damning testimony from those who knew him painted a different picture, one the jury had seen clearly. The courtroom emptied, leaving behind only echoes of the trial's final moments. For Gail's family, it was the end of a long and painful chapter. But for Robert Birnbaum, it was the beginning of a new one, a life spent behind bars, his carefully constructed image now shattered. In the aftermath of the verdict, the courthouse quieted, but the echoes of the trial lingered for Gail Katz's family. The words guilty had brought them a semblance of relief, yet they couldn't ignore the void left by unanswered questions. Justice, while served, felt incomplete. Gail's body was still missing, and with it, a piece of their closure. Her sister sat in the dim light of her living room that evening, flipping through old photo albums. Each image of Gail's smiling face was a reminder of a life cut short. "She deserved more," her sister whispered to no one in particular. The family's grief was compounded by the knowledge that Robert had offered no confession, no remorse, no answers. Outside their circle, the public grappled with the implications of the case. Commentators debated the fairness of convicting someone without a body, while others hailed the verdict as a testament to the power of circumstantial evidence. "It's a precedent," one legal expert said during a primetime news segment. This case shows that even without direct evidence, justice can prevail when the narrative is strong enough. For Gail's friends, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. Sarah, her confidant, couldn't shake the memories of their last conversations. "She told me she was afraid," Sarah said during an interview. "And now, knowing what happened, I can't help but think about how much she must have suffered in those final moments." Meanwhile, inside the prison walls, Robert Birnbaum maintained his silence. He refused to grant interviews or provide any statement beyond what he'd offered in court. His lawyer continued to argue his innocence, filing appeals and citing the lack of direct evidence. But for all his outward composure, Robert's isolation hinted at a man struggling to come to terms with his fate. His fellow inmates, aware of the case's notoriety, kept their distance, leaving Robert to confront his actions alone. Despite the verdict, questions lingered in the minds of investigators. What exactly had Robert done that night? The flight logs and the duffel bag hinted at a grim reality, but without a confession or discovery, the full truth remained elusive. For the lead detective, it was a bitter pill to swallow. "We know he did it," he told a colleague, "but we may never know how or why in full detail. That's what keeps me up at night." Efforts to locate Gail's body continued sporadically, with search teams combing the waters where Robert's plane had flown. Each expedition ended the same way, with empty hands and heavy hearts. For Gail's family, these searches were both a source of hope and a painful reminder of what they had lost. In the years that followed, Gail's story became a symbol of resilience and the fight for justice. Her sister established a foundation in Gail's name, aimed at helping women in abusive relationships find safety and support. "If Gail had had somewhere to turn," she said, during the foundation's launch, "maybe things would have been different." But even as the world moved on, the family held on to the hope that one day Gail's final resting place would be discovered. Until then, they clung to the knowledge that the man responsible was behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. For Robert, the walls of his prison cell grew smaller with each passing day. His reputation, once impeccable, was now irreparably tarnished. The man who had once commanded respect and admiration now faced a lifetime defined by his crimes. Yet, true to form, he showed no signs of breaking. As Gail's family lit a candle in her memory on the anniversary of her disappearance, they reflected on the journey they had endured. Justice had been served, but peace remained elusive. The flame flickered in the dim room, a fragile symbol of hope amid the shadows of uncertainty. As the years passed, the story of Gail Katz and Robert Birnbaum became more than a tragic headline. It became a cautionary tale. Gail's disappearance, the trial, and the ultimate conviction of her husband resonated far beyond the courtroom, leaving an indelible mark on those who heard it. For Gail's sister, the pain of losing her sibling never faded, but she found purpose in turning that pain into action. The foundation she created in Gail's memory grew, offering resources and support to women trapped in abusive relationships. "This is for Gail," she often said at events, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "and for every woman who feels she has no way out." The foundation's work uncovered stories eerily similar to Gail's, women living in fear, isolated by controlling partners. Through education and outreach, it gave them a lifeline Gail never had. Survivors often shared their gratitude, their voices trembling as they recounted how the foundation had saved them. For Gail's family, these moments were bittersweet victories, reminders of the impact one life could have even in its absence. The case also served as a wake-up call for law enforcement and the legal system. Investigators and prosecutors began re-examining the role of circumstantial evidence in securing convictions. Gail's case proved that justice could be achieved even without a body, but it also highlighted the challenges of such prosecutions. Legal experts frequently referenced the trial in discussions about improving investigative techniques and addressing gaps in handling domestic abuse cases. Meanwhile, Robert remained behind bars, his years of freedom traded for a life confined by cold walls and iron bars. Despite his appeals, his convictions stood firm, a testament to the tireless work of those who sought the truth. Yet even in prison, Robert refused to admit guilt. His silence remained as chilling as the crime itself, a stark reminder of the monster Gail had feared. For those who knew Gail, the question of where she was remained an open wound. Her family continued to hold memorials, lighting candles in her honor, and sharing stories of her kindness, humor, and resilience. "She deserved so much more," her sister said at one gathering, tears glistening in her eyes. But we'll never let her be forgotten. Beyond the personal, Gail's story sparked broader conversations about the red flags of abusive relationships. Counselors and educators used her case to illustrate the importance of recognizing early warning signs, control, manipulation, isolation, and intervening before it was too late. Workshops and seminars carried her name, ensuring that her legacy was one of hope and awareness. As the anniversary of her disappearance approached each year, Gail's name would resurface in news articles and documentaries, keeping her memory alive. Her story was a stark reminder of how easily the facade of a perfect life could hide unimaginable darkness. But it was also a testament to resilience, the resilience of a family that refused to give up, a community that demanded answers, and a legal system that fought to deliver justice. And though the truth of what happened to Gail that fateful night may never be fully known, her story became a beacon. It reminded the world that justice, while imperfect, could prevail, that even in the absence of resolution, the fight for answers could inspire change. As the candle flickered on her memorial, casting a warm glow against the evening sky, Gail's family stood together. They spoke her name aloud, ensuring it would never fade. Gail Katz was gone, but her voice would echo on, guiding others toward safety, hope, and the courage to reclaim their lives. What do you think of Robert Birnbaum and the shocking twists of this case? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow true crime enthusiasts, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.